every day at exactly 3 o'clock, she would quietly slip through the back entrance of the music building. Her worn canvas bag hung loosely over her shoulder, filled with dog-eared sheet music that had been photocopied so many times the notes were barely visible. The other students barely noticed her as she made her way down the narrow hallway, past the practice rooms where serious music majors worked on their assignments. She had a routine that never changed. Room 204 was always empty at this time of day, and that's exactly how she liked it. The old upright piano in the corner had seen better days. Several keys stuck when pressed, and the wood was scratched and faded from years of use by countless students. But to her, it was perfect. It was quiet, private, and most importantly, it was free. Growing up, her family couldn't afford piano lessons like the other kids. While her classmates took lessons at fancy studios with grand pianos and professional teachers, she learned everything from library books and free videos on the internet. Her first piano wasn't even a real piano at all. It was a small electronic keyboard her grandmother found at a garage sale for $20. Half the keys didn't work, and it only had one volume setting, which was way too loud for their tiny apartment. But she didn't care. Every morning before school, she would practice on that broken keyboard, wearing headphones so she wouldn't wake up her little brother who slept in the bed next to hers. She taught herself to read music by checking out beginner books from the public library. When those became too easy, she moved on to intermediate books, then advanced ones. She spent hours watching piano tutorials online, pausing and rewinding the same sections over and over until her fingers could find the right keys. Her technique wasn't perfect, and she knew it. The way she held her hands looked different from the pianists she watched in videos. Her finger positioning was unconventional, developed through trial and error rather than proper instruction. Sometimes she used her thumb when she should have used her pinky. Sometimes her wrist was too high or too low, but somehow it worked for her. The music that came from her fingers was beautiful, even if it wasn't technically correct. The university music building became her safe haven when she started college. She wasn't even a music major. She was studying business because her parents said it was practical, something that would guarantee her a job after graduation. But every day after her accounting and marketing classes, she found herself drawn to that old piano in room 200 for like a magnet. She would start with simple warm-up exercises, running her fingers through scales and arpeggios that she had taught herself years ago. Then she would pull out her sheet music, carefully smoothing out the wrinkled pages on the piano's music stand. Her favorites were the classical pieces that made her feel like she was transported to another world. Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata always gave her chills. Chopin's Nocturnes made her feel like she was floating on air. And when she played Debussy's Clair de Lune, she could almost see the moonlight dancing on water. The music students who occasionally passed by room 204 would sometimes pause to listen. They could hear the melody drifting through the thin walls, and while it was clear that the player wasn't formally trained, there was something special about the way she played. There was emotion in every note, a depth of feeling that couldn't be taught in any classroom. But they never stayed long enough to really listen, and they never tried to find out who was playing. She preferred it that way. In room 204, she could play without judgment, without anyone comparing her to the conservatory-trained students who practiced on the expensive grand pianos in the main performance halls. She could make mistakes without anyone rolling their eyes or whispering about her technique. She could play the same phrase 20 times until it felt right, without worrying about bothering anyone. Sometimes, when she thought no one was around, she would venture into more challenging pieces. She had been working on a Rachmaninoff prelude for months, slowly breaking it down into small sections and practicing each hand separately until she could put them together. It was far beyond her supposed skill level, but she was determined to master it. The piece demanded strength and precision that her self-taught technique wasn't designed for, but she adapted, finding her own way to make the music come alive. Her practice sessions were like therapy. Whatever stress she carried from her business, classes, whatever worries she had about her family's financial struggles, whatever doubts she had about her future, all of it melted away when her fingers touched those piano keys for those precious 2 hours every afternoon. She wasn't a struggling college student working part-time jobs to pay for textbooks. She wasn't the girl whose family couldn't afford proper music lessons. She was just a musician, lost in the beauty of the music she created. The irony wasn't lost on her that she spent more time in the music building than most music majors did. While they were in theory classes and ensemble rehearsals, she was teaching herself advanced repertoire that some of them had never even attempted. While they practiced their assigned pieces for grades, she played music that spoke to her soul simply because she loved it. She had learned to be invisible in those hallways. She knew which times of day the practice rooms were empty, which routes to take to avoid the main gathering areas where the music students hung out. She had memorized the schedules of the serious pianists, so she could avoid any awkward encounters. She didn't belong to their world of competitions and recitals and professional aspirations, and she was fine with that. But sometimes, late at night, when she was walking back to her dorm after a particularly inspiring practice session, she would wonder what might have been different if her family had been able to afford lessons when she was younger. Would she have been brave enough to declare music as her major? Would she have been good enough to compete with students who had been training since they were 3 years old? Would she have fit in with the confident, polished musicians who seemed to own every space they entered? These thoughts never lasted long, though. She had learned long ago that there was no point in dwelling on what couldn't be changed. Instead, she focused on what she could control, which was showing up every day at 3 o'clock, sitting down at that old upright piano, and making the most beautiful music she possibly could. And for now, in the quiet sanctuary of room 204, that was enough. On the complete opposite side of the music building, in the grand performance hall, with its soaring ceilings and perfect acoustics, sat a gleaming black Steinway grand piano, worth more than most people's cars. And at that piano, every morning, at precisely 9 o'clock, sat the most talked-about student in the entire music department. He commanded attention the moment he walked into any room. Everything about him screamed privilege and excellence. From his perfectly tailored clothes to the way he carried himself with absolute confidence. While other students hurried through the hallways with overstuffed backpacks and worried expressions, he strolled leisurely, knowing that professors would wait for him if he was late, and that other students would move out of his way without being asked. His story was the stuff of music department legend. Born into a family where classical music wasn't just appreciated, it was a way of life. His parents were both internationally recognized concert pianists who had performed in the world's most prestigious venues. Carnegie Hall, Royal Albert Hall, La Scala. These weren't just names to him, they were places where his family regularly performed and where he had been backstage since he could walk. By age 3, he was already sitting at a piano bench, his tiny fingers guided by private instructors who charged more per hour than most people made in a day. While other toddlers were learning to tie their shoes, he was learning to read music notation. By 5, he was performing in local competitions and winning every single one. By 10, he had already performed as a soloist with regional orchestras, wearing a miniature tuxedo and bowing to standing ovations. His education had been carefully orchestrated by parents who understood exactly how to create a musical prodigy. Summers weren't spent at regular camps, but at exclusive music academies in Switzerland and Austria, where he studied with masters who had taught generations of world-famous pianists. During the school year, he attended a private academy where academics took a back seat to musical development, and where every teacher understood that his piano practice was more important than homework. The university had practically begged him to attend their program. They offered him a full scholarship, private lessons with the department head, and unlimited access to the best practice facilities. But everyone knew he didn't really need to be there. He already had connections in the classical music world that most graduates would never achieve. Record labels were interested in him before he had even finished his degree. Concert promoters knew his name. Critics had written glowing reviews of his performances since he was a teenager. In the practice halls, he was treated like royalty. The main performance hall was essentially his private studio. A sign-up sheet hung outside the door, but somehow his name was always at the top, blocking out entire days for his exclusive use. Other students would peek through the small window in the door, watching him practice pieces that made their assignments look like children's exercises. His technique was absolutely flawless. Every finger moved with mechanical precision. Every phrase was shaped with mathematical perfection. Every dynamic change was executed exactly as marked in the score. When he played, it sounded like a computer had been programmed to produce the ideal performance. There were no wrong notes, no timing issues, no technical problems whatsoever. Professors would bring visiting musicians to hear him play, using him as an example of what perfect training could produce. But his skill came with an attitude that made many people uncomfortable. He wasn't just confident in his abilities, he was dismissive of anyone who didn't meet his impossibly high standards. During master classes, he would sit in the back row with a slight smirk on his face, watching other students stumble through pieces he could play blindfolded. He never offered encouragement or constructive feedback. Instead, he would whisper to his small circle of admirers about technical mistakes or interpretive choices that he found amateurish. His inner circle consisted of other elite music students who basked in his reflected glory. They laughed at his jokes, agreed with his critiques, and defended his sometimes cruel comments as honest professional assessment. Being part of his group meant social status in the music department, so they overlooked his arrogance in exchange for association with his talent and connections. He had strong opinions about what constituted real musicianship, and he wasn't shy about sharing them. In his view, anyone who hadn't started training before age 5 was already at a hopeless disadvantage. Self-taught musicians were amateurs playing at being serious, and their technical deficiencies were obvious to anyone with proper training. He believed that music was about precision, control, and flawless execution, not about emotion or personal expression, which he saw as excuses for technical inadequacy. During department gatherings, he would hold court near the grand piano, regaling anyone who would listen with stories of his performances and his connections in the professional music world. He name-dropped famous musicians he had met, described exclusive events he had attended, and casually mentioned opportunities that had been offered to him. Other students listened with a mixture of admiration and resentment, knowing they would never have access to the world he described. His practice sessions were legendary among the students. He would arrive at the performance hall each morning with expensive leather portfolios, containing perfectly organized sheet music. Every piece was marked with precise fingerings and interpretive notes in his neat handwriting. He never seemed to struggle with anything. If a passage was difficult, he would simply slow it down and repeat it until it was perfect, then gradually increase the tempo until it sounded effortless. What made him even more intimidating was his vast repertoire. While other students spent months learning a single sonata, he seemed to have dozens of major works memorized and performance-ready at any given time. Professors would mention a piece in class, and he would casually offer to demonstrate it, then proceed to play it flawlessly from memory, while other students scrambled to find the music in their books. He had already won the university's prestigious concerto competition twice, performing with the City Symphony Orchestra to sold-out audiences. The local newspaper had written glowing reviews, calling him a rising star in the classical music world. These articles were framed and displayed in the music department's main hallway, serving as inspiration to other students and a constant reminder of the level of excellence the program could produce. But despite all his accomplishments and obvious talent, there was something missing from his playing that even he couldn't identify. Technically, his performances were perfect. Musically, they were correct and polished. But audiences, while impressed by his skill, rarely seemed moved by his interpretations. Critics praised his technique, but stopped short of calling his playing truly inspiring. It was as if all his training had produced a beautiful, expensive machine that could reproduce music perfectly but couldn't quite capture its soul. This subtle gap between technical perfection and emotional connection was something he refused to acknowledge, instead focusing on the measurable aspects of his success: the competitions won, the scholarships earned, the connections made. In his mind, these concrete achievements were what mattered in the music world, and anyone who suggested otherwise simply didn't understand what professional musicianship required. The monthly student showcase was supposed to be a friendly, supportive event where music students could share their progress with peers and faculty. The atmosphere was usually relaxed and encouraging, with students cheering each other on regardless of skill level. It was meant to be a safe space for learning and growth, not a competition. But that particular evening in October would change everything for the quiet girl, who had been secretly practicing in room 204. She had been thinking about signing up for months. Watching other students perform pieces she knew she could play just as well, if not better. Every time the sign-up sheet appeared on the music department bulletin board, she would walk past it several times, pen in hand, before chickening out at the last minute. The thought of playing in front of an audience terrified her, but it also excited her in a way she couldn't explain. This time felt different though. She had been working on Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major for weeks, and she finally felt ready to share it with others. The piece was beautiful and expressive, perfect for showing the emotional depth she brought to her playing. It wasn't the most technically challenging piece in the world, but she had poured her heart into learning every phrase, every delicate ornament, every subtle dynamic change. On the day the sign-up sheet went up, she forced herself to walk directly to the bulletin board without hesitation. Her hand shook slightly as she wrote her name in the empty slot, but once it was done, she felt a rush of excitement mixed with pure terror. She was finally going to show people what she could do. She was finally going to step out of the shadows of room 204 and into the light. The week leading up to the showcase flew by in a blur of nervous practice sessions. She ran through the Chopin Nocturne dozens of times, polishing every detail until she could play it with her eyes closed. She practiced walking onto the stage, sitting at the bench, adjusting the height, and positioning her hands. She even practiced bowing, though she felt silly doing it in the empty practice room. The night of the showcase, the small recital hall was buzzing with the usual pre-performance energy. Students chatted nervously in the lobby, warming up in practice rooms, and peeking at the program to see who was performing what. The audience was a mix of music students, faculty members, and a few proud family members who had driven in for the evening. She arrived early, wearing the only black dress she owned, a simple one her mother had bought her for job interviews. It wasn't fancy, but it was appropriate for a classical performance. She found a seat in the back row, clutching her sheet music even though she had the piece memorized. Her heart was pounding so hard she was sure people around her could hear it. The elite pianist and his usual group of followers had claimed the entire front row, as they always did during department events. He lounged in his seat, wearing an expensive black suit, looking like he belonged on the stage of a major concert hall rather than in a small university recital room. His friends surrounded him, all dressed equally well, creating an intimidating wall of musical establishment. As the evening progressed, student after student took the stage. There were some beautiful performances, a lovely Mozart sonata movement, a passionate Brahms intermezzo, a technically impressive Bach invention. The audience was warm and supportive, applauding enthusiastically after each piece, regardless of how polished the performance was. But she noticed that the front row group wasn't quite as generous with their appreciation. During some of the less polished performances, she could see them whispering to each other, occasionally smirking or rolling their eyes at technical mistakes. It made her stomach twist with nervousness, but she tried to focus on the positive energy from the rest of the audience. When her name was finally called, the moment felt surreal. She stood up on shaky legs and walked toward the stage, her simple black dress making her feel underdressed compared to the elaborate concert gowns some of the other female performers had worn. The stage lights were brighter than she had expected, and for a moment she couldn't see the audience at all, which was actually a relief. The grand piano on stage was nothing like the old upright in room 204. This instrument was magnificent, a full-sized concert grand with perfect action and a rich, resonant tone. As she sat on the bench and adjusted the height, she tried to calm her nerves by focusing on the music she was about to share. This was her moment to show everyone the passion and dedication she had poured into her playing. But the moment her fingers touched the keys for the opening phrase of the Chopin Nocturne, she heard it. A quiet snicker from the front row, followed by a whispered comment that was just loud enough for several people to hear. "Look at her hand position. Has she ever had a proper lesson?" The comment hit her like a physical blow. Suddenly, she became hyper-aware of everything she was doing wrong. Her wrist felt too high, her fingers felt clumsy, her pedaling felt inconsistent. The beautiful melody she had practiced so lovingly began to sound amateurish in her own ears. She could feel the blood rushing to her face, and her hands started to shake slightly. More whispered comments drifted up from the front row. "This is painful to watch. She's rushing the tempo. Someone should have stopped her from signing up." Each comment was like a knife, cutting away at the confidence she had spent weeks building up. His friends giggled quietly at his critiques, turning what should have been a supportive environment into something that felt hostile and judgmental. She tried to focus on the music, to remember why she loved this piece so much, but the magic was gone. Every phrase felt labored, every ornament felt awkward, every dynamic change felt forced. The piano that had felt so wonderful under her fingers moments before now seemed to be fighting against her, highlighting every technical imperfection in her self-taught technique. The audience beyond the front row was still listening politely, some even seeming to enjoy the performance, despite its obvious nervousness. But all she could hear were the continued whispers and barely suppressed laughter from the group of elite students who had appointed themselves as judges of musical worthiness. By the time she reached the final delicate phrases of the nocturne, her confidence was completely shattered. The ending, which she had practiced hundreds of times until it felt natural and expressive, came out tentative and uncertain. She held the final chord longer than necessary, not because of artistic intent, but because she was dreading the moment when she would have to stand up and face the audience. The applause that followed was polite but scattered. Most of the audience clapped warmly, genuinely appreciating her effort and the obvious love she had for the music. But the damage was done. As she stood to bow, she could see the smirks on the faces in the front row, and she could hear one final, devastating comment, delivered just loudly enough for her to hear. That's what happens when people try to play above their level. She managed to bow quickly and walk off the stage without crying, but barely. In the wings, she stood in the darkness, listening to the next performer begin their piece, a technically flawless batch prelude and fugue that made her own performance seem even more amateurish by comparison. The contrast was brutal and undeniable as she made her way back to her seat. She avoided eye contact with everyone, especially the front row group, who she could hear already discussing the next performance as if hers had never happened. The rest of the showcase passed in a blur. She sat in her chair, applauding mechanically for the other performers, but inside she felt hollowed out and humiliated. The evening that was supposed to mark her emergence as a musician had instead become a public confirmation of all her worst fears about not belonging in this world. The morning after the showcase, she hoped that maybe people would forget about what happened, Maybe everyone would move on to other things, and she could quietly return to her practice sessions in room 204 without anyone remembering her embarrassing performance. But as she walked through the music building on her way to grab some sheet music from the library, she quickly realized that her humiliation was far from over. She could hear whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when she passed by. Groups of students who were chatting animatedly would suddenly fall silent as she approached, then resume talking in hushed tones after she walked past. It was the kind of obvious social behavior that made her stomach drop, because she knew exactly what they were discussing. Her performance had become the topic of conversation, and not in a good way. The elite pianist's critique had spread through the music department like wildfire. In a small, tight-knit community like theirs, news traveled fast, especially when it involved someone as influential as him. His opinions carried weight with other students, and his harsh judgment of her performance was being repeated and amplified throughout the building. She overheard fragments of conversations that made her want to disappear into the floor. "Did you hear what he said about that girl's technique? I heard she's not even a music major. Someone said she learned to play from YouTube videos. No wonder her hand position looked so weird." Each comment felt like a fresh wound, reminding her over and over again of how exposed and vulnerable she had felt on that stage. What made it worse was how the story was growing and changing with each retelling. What had started as criticism of her technique was becoming exaggerated into something much more damaging. Some students were saying she had completely fallen apart during the performance. Others claimed she had played the wrong notes throughout the entire piece. A few even suggested that she had never learned to read music properly. The practice rooms, which had always been her refuge, now felt hostile. She would walk down the hallways looking for an empty room, and she could feel eyes following her. Students who had never paid attention to her before were now very aware of who she was, but for all the wrong reasons. She had wanted to be noticed for her musical ability, and instead, she was notorious for her lack of it. Her usual practice time became a source of anxiety rather than joy. Every time she sat down at the piano in room 204, she could hear his voice in her head, pointing out everything that was wrong with her playing. Her hand position, which had never bothered her before, suddenly felt awkward and unnatural. Her pedaling, which she had thought was expressive, now seemed random and inconsistent. Even pieces she had played confidently for years started to feel uncertain under her fingers. The social isolation was perhaps the most painful part. Students who had been friendly acquaintances before the showcase now avoided her entirely, not because they were cruel people, but because associating with someone who had been so publicly criticized by the most influential student in the department felt socially risky. In the competitive world of the music department, reputation mattered, and being connected to someone who had been labeled as inadequate could hurt their own standing. Even the faculty seemed to treat her differently. Professor Williams, who taught music theory and had always been encouraging when she asked questions after class, now gave her polite but distant responses. Dr. Chen, who supervised the practice rooms, looked uncomfortable when she signed up for her usual time slots. It was as if her public failure had confirmed something they had all been thinking privately, that she didn't really belong there. The worst part was lunchtime in the music building cafeteria. She used to enjoy sitting near the piano students, listening to their conversations about repertoire and upcoming performances. But now, when she approached with her tray, conversations would shift, or people would suddenly remember they needed to be somewhere else. The elite pianist's table, which had always been the center of attention, seemed to draw even larger crowds as students gathered to hear his latest observations about musical standards and proper training. She started eating lunch alone, sitting at small tables in corners where she could avoid being seen. Sometimes she would skip lunch altogether, choosing to spend the time in the library, where the silence felt less hostile than the whispered conversations in the cafeteria. The books there didn't judge her technique or question her background. She could lose herself in biographies of famous composers and historical accounts of great performances. Imagining a world where passion mattered more than pedigree, her academic classes outside the music department became her only safe space. In her business courses, nobody knew about her musical aspirations or her public failure. She could sit in lectures about accounting and marketing, taking notes on subjects that felt practical and achievable. These classrooms didn't remind her of her inadequacies or make her question her abilities. They were just normal spaces where she could be anonymous again. But even there, she found herself distracted and unable to concentrate. Her mind would wander back to that night on stage, replaying every moment of humiliation. She would think about all the hours she had spent practicing, all the joy she had found in making music alone, and wonder if it had all been a delusion. Maybe she really was as amateur as everyone now believed. Maybe all those years of teaching herself had just created bad habits that could never be corrected. The practice room sign-up sheets became a source of daily anxiety. She would approach them hesitantly, wondering if other students would notice her name and make comments. Sometimes she would write her name down and then erase it, unsure if she even deserved to use the facilities anymore. When she did sign up, she chose times when the building was nearly empty, early in the morning or late at night, when she was less likely to encounter other students. Her playing during these isolated practice sessions was tentative and self-conscious. Every phrase felt like it was being judged by invisible critics. She would start a piece with confidence, but then his voice would echo in her memory, pointing out her flaws, and her fingers would tense up. Music that had once flowed naturally from her heart now felt forced and mechanical as she tried to fix problems she wasn't even sure she understood. The joy that had sustained her through years of solitary practice was slowly being drained away. Playing piano had always been her escape from stress and worry, but now it had become a source of stress itself. She began to question everything about her musical journey. Had she been fooling herself all these years? Were all those hours of practice just wasted time? Did she really have any talent at all, or had she just been playing at being a musician? Some nights, she would lie in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying conversations she wished she could have. She imagined defending herself, explaining that she had taught herself everything from scratch, that she had overcome obstacles that most students couldn't imagine. But even in her fantasies, the arguments felt weak. In a world that valued proper training and technical perfection, her story of self-taught determination seemed naive and irrelevant. The worst moments came when she walked past the main performance hall and heard him practicing. His playing was undeniably beautiful, technically flawless, and completely confident. The contrast between his assured performance and her own shaky attempts felt overwhelming. It was like comparing a professional athlete to someone who had learned sports by watching videos in their backyard. The gap seemed impossible to bridge. As weeks passed, she began to seriously consider giving up piano altogether. Maybe it was time to accept that music was just a hobby for her, something she could enjoy privately but never share with others. Maybe she should focus entirely on her business degree and stop pretending she could ever be a real musician. The thought of quitting felt like losing a part of herself, but staying felt like setting herself up for continued humiliation and disappointment. What nobody in that recital hall knew, what the elite pianist and his followers couldn't have imagined, was that the girl they had just humiliated was hiding a secret that would have changed everything. The story of her musical journey wasn't what it appeared to be on the surface. Behind her simple clothes and self-taught technique lay a past that she had carefully hidden from everyone at the university. 12 years earlier, when she was just 8 years old, she had been a completely different person living a completely different life. Her family lived in a beautiful house in the suburbs, with a living room dominated by a gleaming baby grand piano that her parents had saved for years to buy. Her father worked as an engineer for a major corporation, and her mother was a teacher who had always dreamed of having a musical family. Back then, piano lessons weren't a luxury her family couldn't afford. They were simply a natural part of growing up. Every Tuesday and Thursday after school, a professional instructor would come to their house for private lessons. Mrs. Patterson was a classically trained pianist who had studied at prestigious conservatories and performed professionally before becoming a teacher. She was demanding but patient, pushing her young student to achieve technical perfection while nurturing her obviously natural talent. Those early years of proper training had been magical. She absorbed everything Mrs. Patterson taught her like a sponge soaking up water. Her small fingers flew across the keys with increasing confidence and skill. She learned to read music as easily as she read books, sight-reading pieces that impressed even her experienced teacher. Her technique was textbook perfect. Curved fingers, relaxed wrists, proper pedaling, everything exactly as it should be. By age 10, she was performing in local competitions and winning consistently. The trophies lined the shelves in her bedroom, each one representing hours of dedicated practice and careful instruction. Other young pianists and their parents knew her name. Teachers from neighboring cities would come to hear her play, marveling at her combination of technical skill and musical maturity. The crowning achievement came when she was 12 years old. The state youth piano competition was the most prestigious event for young musicians in the region, drawing hundreds of talented kids from across the state. She had prepared for months, working with Mrs. Patterson on a challenging Chopin ballade that showcased both her technical abilities and her growing artistic sophistication. The day of the competition, she wore a beautiful blue velvet dress that her mother had specially ordered for the occasion. Her father took time off work to drive her to the state capitol, where the competition was held in a magnificent concert hall with perfect acoustics and a stunning concert grand piano. She felt like a real professional musician as she walked onto that stage. Her performance that day was extraordinary. Every note was perfectly placed, every phrase carefully shaped, every technical passage executed with confidence and flair. The judges were impressed not just by her accuracy, but by her musical understanding that seemed far beyond her years. When they announced her name as the first-place winner, her parents cried with joy in the audience. That victory opened doors that most young musicians only dream about. She was invited to perform as a soloist with the regional youth orchestra, playing a Mozart concerto to a sold-out audience. Music schools from across the country began sending recruitment letters, hoping to attract her to their programs when she was ready for advanced study. Mrs. Patterson arranged for her to audition with a master teacher in New York City, one of the most respected piano pedagogues in the world. The audition in New York was like stepping into a fairy tale. The teacher's studio was in a historic building near Lincoln Center, filled with photographs of famous pianists and awards from international competitions. When she played for the master teacher, the response was immediate and enthusiastic. "This child has extraordinary gifts," she told her parents. With proper training, she could have a significant career as a concert pianist. Plans were made for her to begin studying with this master teacher the following year. It would mean traveling to New York twice a month for lessons. A significant expense, but one her parents were willing to make for their daughter's talent. Her musical future seemed bright and clearly defined. She would continue her advanced training, compete in national and international competitions, and eventually pursue a career as a professional concert pianist. But life has a way of changing course when you least expect it. Just 2 months after that triumphant audition in New York, her father came home from work with devastating news. The company where he had worked for 15 years was restructuring, and his entire department was being eliminated. At 45 years old, with a mortgage and a family to support, he suddenly found himself unemployed with limited prospects in a competitive job market. The job search dragged on for months. Her father applied for positions across the country, But the economy was struggling, and companies weren't hiring experienced engineers at his salary level. Their savings began to dwindle as they tried to maintain their lifestyle while he looked for work. The piano lessons were the first luxury to go. Mrs. Patterson was understanding but couldn't continue teaching without payment. Then her mother got sick. What started as persistent fatigue and unexplained symptoms eventually led to a diagnosis of a chronic autoimmune condition that required expensive treatments and frequent medical appointments. Her mother had to stop working entirely, eliminating their second source of income. Just when they needed it most, the beautiful house with the baby grand piano had to be sold. They moved into a small apartment across town, in a neighborhood where the schools weren't as good, and dreams felt more like luxuries than possibilities. The piano couldn't fit in their new home, so it was sold too, along with most of their other possessions. Watching strangers carry away her beloved instrument was one of the most heartbreaking moments of her young life. Her father eventually found work, but it paid significantly less than his previous job and required long hours that left him exhausted and stressed. The family's focus shifted from nurturing musical talent to simply surviving financially. The lessons with the master teacher in New York became an impossible dream, and even local instruction was out of reach. She tried to keep playing using the old keyboards at school, but it wasn't the same. The instrument was barely functional, and there was no time for serious practice between helping her mother with household tasks and watching her younger brother after school. Her technique, which had been so carefully developed over years of proper instruction, began to deteriorate. From lack of guided practice, the transition to her new life was brutal. At her new school, there was no music program to speak of, and none of her classmates understood what she had lost. She went from being a celebrated young artist to just another struggling student in an underfunded school district. The awards and trophies from her competition days were packed away in boxes, too painful to display in their cramped apartment. As months turned into years, her musical identity began to fade. She learned to adapt, to find ways to make music with whatever resources were available. The broken keyboard her grandmother found at a garage sale became her new piano. YouTube videos replaced Mrs. Patterson's expert guidance. Library books substituted for expensive method books and sheet music, but she never forgot what it felt like to play on a real piano, to have proper training, to perform with confidence and skill. That knowledge lived inside her like a secret flame, hidden but never completely extinguished. She taught herself to play in a way that worked with her limitations, developing techniques that were unconventional but effective. She learned to create beauty despite her circumstances, not because of them. The girl who sat at that old upright piano in room 200 for every afternoon was not the amateur that everyone assumed she was. She was a fallen prodigy, a former competition winner, a musician who had once been destined for greatness, but had learned to find joy in small, private moments of musical connection. Her technique might have looked unpolished to untrained eyes, but it was built on a foundation of excellence that most students never achieve. 3 weeks after the humiliating showcase, she had practically stopped coming to the music building altogether. Her business classes were keeping her busy enough, and she told herself that maybe it was time to focus on something more practical. Anyway, the piano had brought her nothing but embarrassment at the university, so why keep torturing herself? She convinced herself that she was moving on, that she was being mature and realistic about her future, but her older brother could see right through her act. When he came to visit her on campus that weekend, he immediately noticed something was wrong. They had always been close, and he knew her better than anyone else in the family. He remembered the little girl who used to wake up before dawn to practice piano, the kid who would rather skip birthday parties to work on a difficult piece, the teenager who had cried when they had to sell their piano. "You look miserable," he said as they sat in the campus coffee shop, watching students hurry past with their backpacks and stressed expressions. "And don't tell me it's just because of schoolwork. I know that look." You get it whenever someone tells you that you can't do something musical. She tried to brush off his concern, insisting that she was fine, that she was just busy with her business classes and thinking about her future career. But he wasn't buying it. He had seen her go through the family's financial crisis, watched her adapt to losing everything she had worked for musically, and he knew that giving up wasn't really in her nature. Something had happened to make her retreat this far, and he was determined to find out what. It took an hour of gentle questioning before she finally told him the whole story. She described the showcase, the cruel comments from the front row, the way other students had started avoiding her, and how she had begun to question everything about her musical abilities. As she talked, her brother's expression grew more and more serious, but not in the way she expected. "Wait a minute," he said, interrupting her mid-sentence. "Let me get this straight. Some spoiled rich kid who's never had to work for anything in his life made fun of your technique, and now you're ready to give up music completely. The same music that kept you sane when Dad lost his job. The same music that you used to practice 4 hours, even when we could barely afford to keep the lights on." His words stung because they were true. She had survived much worse things than one embarrassing performance. When they lost their house, she hadn't given up playing piano. She had found ways to keep making music with whatever was available. When they couldn't afford lessons anymore, she hadn't quit. She had taught herself using every resource she could find. When they had to sell her beloved piano, she hadn't stopped playing. She had practiced on broken keyboards and out-tune instruments at school. "You know what your problem is," her brother continued, his voice getting more passionate. "You've forgotten who you really are. You're not some amateur who learned to play from YouTube videos. You're the kid who won the state championship. You're the musician who made that fancy teacher in New York say you had extraordinary gifts. You're the girl who kept playing beautiful music, even when everything else in your life fell apart." He reminded her of things she had tried to forget, not because they were painful, but because remembering them made her current situation feel even more frustrating. He talked about the competitions she had won, the audiences that had given her standing ovations, the musical moments that had made grown adults cry. "That talent didn't just disappear," he insisted. "It's still there. You've just been hiding it because you're scared of getting hurt again." As they talked, something shifted inside her. The anger that had been buried under weeks of shame and self-doubt began to surface. She was angry at the elite pianist for his cruelty, angry at the other students for their shallow judgments, but mostly angry at herself for letting them convince her that she didn't belong in the musical world. She had worked too hard and overcome too much to let someone else's opinion define her worth as a musician. "There's a concerto competition coming up, isn't there?" her brother asked, pulling out his phone to look at the music department's website. "I remember you mentioning it before. That's the big one, right? The one where the winner gets to perform with the real orchestra." She nodded reluctantly. The annual concerto competition was indeed the most prestigious event in the music department. It was open to all students, but the level of competition was intimidating. Previous winners had gone on to professional careers and graduate programs at top conservatories. The elite pianist had won it for the past 2 years running, and everyone expected him to claim it again this year. "So enter it," her brother said, simply. "Show them what you can really do." The suggestion seemed impossible at first. The competition required performing a full concerto movement with piano accompaniment, then potentially with the orchestra if you made it to the finals. These were major works that demanded months of preparation and a level of technique that she wasn't sure she could demonstrate anymore. The other competitors would be the most advanced students in the department, people who had been training intensively for years. But as the idea settled in her mind, it began to feel less crazy and more like exactly what she needed to do. The competition would give her a chance to perform a piece that could really showcase her abilities, not just a simple nocturne that didn't demonstrate her full range. It would be an opportunity to remind everyone, including herself, of what she was truly capable of. "I don't know if I can do it," she admitted. "It's been so long since I played anything really challenging, and the competition is only 2 months away. That's not much time to prepare a major concerto." "2 months is plenty of time for someone with your background," her brother replied confidently. "Besides, you don't need to learn it from scratch. You just need to remember what you already know. All those years of proper training didn't disappear. They're still part of you, waiting to come back out." That night, she lay in bed thinking about the conversation. Her brother was right. She had been hiding her true abilities, playing it safe with simple pieces that wouldn't attract attention or criticism. But playing it safe had only led to more humiliation, not less. Maybe it was time to take a real risk, to put everything on the line and see what happened. The next morning, she walked to the music building with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in weeks. The concerto competition sign-up sheet was posted outside the main office, and most of the slots were already filled with familiar names, the top students in the department, including the elite pianist who had signed up for the earliest available. Audition time. She stood in front of the sheet for several minutes, pen in hand, reading through the list of competitors. These were serious musicians with impressive credentials and years of intensive training. But then she remembered her brother's words about not letting fear make decisions for her, and she wrote her name in one of the remaining slots. The moment she signed up, whispers started spreading through the music building. Students who saw her name on the list couldn't hide their surprise and, in some cases, their amusement. The girl who had embarrassed herself at the showcase was now signing up for the most competitive event of the year. It seemed like she was setting herself up for an even more spectacular failure. The elite pianist's reaction was particularly telling. When he saw her name on the list, he actually laughed out loud. "This should be entertaining," he told his friends. "I guess some people never learn when to quit." His confidence was absolute. He had never lost this competition, and he certainly wasn't going to lose it to someone he considered a musical amateur. But she didn't care about the whispers or the laughter anymore. For the first time in weeks, she felt like herself again. She had a goal, a challenge worthy of her real abilities, and a chance to prove that talent and determination could overcome privilege and prejudice. The competition would give her exactly what she needed, a stage big enough to show everyone who she really was. The morning after signing up for the competition, she woke up with a mixture of excitement and terror. 2 months to prepare for the most important performance of her life seemed both like forever and no time at all. She had committed herself to something that would either vindicate everything she believed about her musical abilities or confirm everyone's worst assumptions about her lack of training. The first challenge was choosing which concerto to perform. The competition allowed any standard concerto from the classical repertoire, and most students chose pieces that were technically impressive but manageable within their skill level. She spent hours in the music library, pulling scores from the shelves and reading through possibilities. Mozart concertos were elegant, but might seem too simple. Beethoven concertos were powerful, but incredibly demanding. Chopin concertos were beautiful, but required a level of poetic interpretation that might be hard to achieve under pressure. Then she found it. Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 in C minor. The moment she opened the score, she knew this was the piece that would either make or break her comeback. It was one of the most technically demanding and emotionally complex works in the entire piano repertoire. The opening alone, with its massive thundering chords, required more strength and precision than most pianists could muster. The intricate passages demanded perfect coordination between both hands, and the lyrical sections needed the kind of mature musical understanding that usually came only with years of professional experience. Most students wouldn't dare attempt Rachmaninoff at this level. Even the elite pianist, for all his technical skill, had always chosen more conservative repertoire for competitions. But something about this concerto called to her. Maybe it was the way it demanded everything from a performer. technical brilliance, emotional depth, physical strength, and artistic maturity. Or maybe it was because she remembered hearing a recording of it years ago during her competition days, and it had moved her to tears. She checked the score out of the library and took it back to her dorm room to study. As she read through the first movement, memories of her proper training began to surface. She could hear her old teacher's voice explaining how to approach difficult passages, how to build stamina for demanding repertoire, how to practice efficiently to avoid injury. The knowledge was still there, buried under years of making do with inferior instruments and self-guided practice. The next hurdle was finding adequate practice time in space. Room 204, with its broken keys and inconsistent action, wouldn't be sufficient for preparing Rachmaninoff. She needed access to a real piano, preferably one of the better instruments in the music building. But those practice rooms were typically reserved for music majors, and they were almost always occupied during regular hours. She developed a strategy of arriving at the music building before dawn, when the building was unlocked but empty. At 5:30 in the morning, she could have her pick of practice rooms, including some with decent grand pianos that weren't available during peak hours. The early morning sessions became sacred time, when she could work on the most challenging passages without worrying about other students hearing her. Struggles. The first weeks of preparation were humbling and frustrating. Her fingers, which had maintained basic dexterity through her daily practice sessions, weren't prepared for the demands of Rachmaninoff. The massive chords left her hands aching, and the rapid passages exposed weaknesses in her technique that had developed during her years of self-teaching. There were days when she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake, if she was setting herself up for an even more spectacular failure than the showcase. But gradually, something remarkable began to happen as she worked through the concerto. Measure by measure, her body began to remember things her mind had forgotten. Muscle memory from her years of proper training started to resurface. Her hands found positions and movements that felt familiar, even though she hadn't used them in years. The technical foundation that had been built during her childhood lessons was still there, waiting to be rediscovered. She developed an intensive practice routine that consumed every free moment of her day. Early morning sessions focused on technical work, scales, arpeggios, and isolated difficult passages played slowly and repeatedly until they became automatic. Afternoon sessions were devoted to putting sections together and working on musical interpretation. Late evening sessions, often extending past midnight, were for playing through complete movements and building the stamina needed for performance. Her approach to practice was methodical and strategic, drawing on techniques she had learned from her childhood teacher, but applying them with the discipline and focus of someone who had something significant to prove. She identified every technical challenge in the piece and created specific exercises to address each one. She practiced difficult passages with different rhythms and accents to ensure her fingers knew exactly where to go. She worked on sections, hands separately until each hand could play its part perfectly before putting them together. The physical demands of the piece were unlike anything she had attempted in years. Rachmaninoff had enormous hands and wrote music that required significant reach and strength. She had to relearn how to use her entire body when playing, engaging her back and shoulders to generate the power needed for the massive climaxes. Her forearms ached constantly during the first month of preparation, and she had to be careful not to overdo it and risk injury. But it wasn't just the technical aspects that challenged her. The Rachmaninoff concerto demanded a level of emotional and artistic maturity that went far beyond correct notes and accurate timing. Each movement told a story, painted emotional landscapes that ranged from desperate anguish to triumphant joy. She had to rediscover her ability to communicate through music, to make the piano sing with the kind of expression that connected with listeners on a deep level. As the weeks passed, faculty members who happened to be in the building during her early morning practice sessions began to take notice. The music coming from those practice rooms didn't sound like typical student work. There was something profound and moving about it, something that suggested a level of musical understanding that was rare among undergraduates. A few professors made excuses to walk past the practice rooms during her sessions, curious about who was playing with such intensity and skill. Dr. Peterson, the piano department head, was one of the first to realize what was happening. He had been in his office early one morning when he heard someone working on the Rachmaninoff's second concerto. The playing was extraordinary, technically solid, but more importantly, musically compelling in a way that suggested real artistry. When he discreetly checked to see who was practicing, he was shocked to discover it was the girl who had been publicly criticized. Just weeks earlier, her transformation was becoming impossible to ignore. Students who encountered her in the hallways noticed a change in her demeanor. The defeated, embarrassed person who had been avoiding eye contact and hurrying through the building was gone. In her place was someone who walked with purpose and confidence, someone who seemed to be carrying herself like the serious musician. She was becoming once again the elite pianist, and his circle of followers began to hear rumors about her preparation. But they dismissed them as exaggerated gossip. There was no way the girl who had stumbled through a simple Chopin nocturne could be preparing one of the most difficult concertos in the repertoire. Even if she was working on it, they reasoned, there was a huge difference between practicing a piece and being able to perform it convincingly in competition against the department's most skilled students. But as the competition date approached, her confidence grew stronger every day. She wasn't just preparing a difficult piece of music. She was reconnecting with the musician she had always been inside. The hours of intense practice were stripping away years of self-doubt and revealing the artist who had been hidden beneath the surface. Every passage that clicked into place, every musical phrase that suddenly made sense, every moment when the piano responded to her touch exactly as she intended was proof that her talent hadn't disappeared. It had just been waiting for the right moment to re-emerge. The final weeks of preparation took on an almost mystical quality. She was no longer just practicing notes and rhythms. She was channeling everything she had experienced, all the loss and struggle and determination of the past few years, into her interpretation of the music. The Rachmaninoff became a vehicle for expressing emotions she had never been able to put into words, a way of transforming her pain and resilience into something beautiful and powerful. The day of the concerto competition arrived, with all the fanfare and tension that the music department could muster. The university's main concert hall had been transformed for the occasion, with professional stage lighting and sound equipment that made even seasoned performers feel the weight of the moment. This wasn't just another student recital. This was the event that would determine who would represent the university as soloist with the City Symphony Orchestra, an honor that could launch a professional career. Backstage, the competitors prepared in their own ways. Some paced nervously, running through difficult passages on silent practice keyboards. Others sat quietly, eyes closed, mentally rehearsing their performances. The atmosphere was thick with nervous energy and barely contained ambition. Everyone knew that careers could be made or broken on this stage, and the pressure was unlike anything most of them had ever experienced. She arrived at the hall 3 hours before her scheduled performance time, carrying her sheet music in the same worn folder she had used since high school. Her simple black dress was the same one she had worn to the disastrous showcase, but this time she felt completely different wearing it. Instead of feeling underdressed and out of place, she felt focused and ready. The weeks of intense preparation had given her a quiet confidence that radiated from within. The competition format was straightforward but demanding. Each contestant would perform one movement of their chosen concerto with piano accompaniment, and a panel of distinguished judges would select 3 finalists to perform with the full orchestra the following week. The performances were open to the public, and the concert hall was packed with students, faculty, family members, and local music lovers who had heard about the exceptional level of talent competing this year. The elite pianist was scheduled to perform first, a strategic choice that would set the bar high and potentially intimidate the other competitors. He had chosen Chopin's Piano Concerto No. 1, a work that perfectly showcased his technical precision and classical training. As he walked onto the stage in his perfectly tailored formal wear, he looked every inch the professional concert pianist he was destined to become. His performance was everything the audience expected, technically flawless, musically sophisticated, and delivered with the kind of confidence that comes from years of winning competitions. Every note was perfectly placed, every phrase carefully shaped, every dynamic change executed with mathematical precision. The audience responded with enthusiastic applause, and the judges nodded appreciatively. It was a performance that would be difficult to surpass, and everyone in the hall knew it. As the other competitors took their turns, the standard remained impressively high. A senior music major delivered a passionate interpretation of Grieg's Piano Concerto. A graduate student performed Beethoven's Emperor Concerto with remarkable authority. Each performance had its merits, but none seemed to reach the level set by the opening act. The elite pianist sat in the front row, watching with the satisfied expression of someone who knew he had already won. When her name was finally called, a ripple of whispered conversations ran through the audience. Many people remembered her from the showcase debacle and couldn't understand why she was competing at this level. Some faculty members leaned forward in their seats, curious to see if the rumors about her preparation were true. The elite pianist smirked and settled back in his chair, expecting to be entertained by another embarrassing performance. She walked onto the stage with steady steps, acknowledging the accompanist with a professional nod before taking her place at the magnificent concert grand piano. The instrument was a far cry from the broken keyboards and old uprights she had been practicing on for years. As she adjusted the bench and placed her hands above the keys, she felt a moment of perfect calm. This was where she belonged. The opening of Rachmaninoff's Second Piano Concerto begins with a series of massive dramatic chords that announce the soloist's presence with unmistakable authority. From the very first chord, it was clear that something extraordinary was happening on that stage. The sound that emerged from the piano was not just technically accurate, it was emotionally devastating, filled with power and passion that seemed to come from the deepest part of her soul. The audience, which had been settling into their seats and shuffling programs, fell completely silent. The elite pianist's smirk vanished as he sat up straighter, his face registering shock and disbelief. The judges, who had been taking polite notes throughout the evening, put down their pens and simply listened, transfixed by what they were hearing. This was not the same person who had nervously stumbled through a simple nocturne months earlier. The transformation was so complete that many people in the audience wondered if they were witnessing the same performer. Her technique was not just adequate, it was spectacular, demonstrating a level of skill and artistry that most professional pianists would envy. But more than that, her playing had something that couldn't be taught in any conservatory, a depth of emotion and life experience that gave every phrase authentic meaning. The first movement of the Rachmaninoff Concerto is a journey through the full range of human emotions, from desperate anguish to triumphant joy, and she navigated every twist and turn with the skill of a seasoned artist. During the tender lyrical passages, her touch was so delicate that the piano seemed to sing like a human voice. During the thunderous climaxes, she summoned power and intensity that filled every corner of the concert hall. The piano accompaniment, played by a faculty member who had performed with major orchestras around the world, struggled to keep up with her passionate interpretation. He had accompanied dozens of competitions over the years, but rarely had he encountered a soloist who demanded such complete musical partnership. She wasn't just playing the notes, she was telling a story, painting emotional landscapes that drew everyone in the hall into her musical world. As the movement progressed, it became clear that the audience was witnessing something special, the kind of performance that would be talked about for years to come. People in the back rows craned their necks to get a better view. Faculty members exchanged amazed glances. Students who had dismissed her as an amateur sat in stunned silence, realizing they had completely misjudged her abilities. The elite pianist watched in growing horror as his assumptions about musical superiority crumbled before his eyes. This girl, whom he had publicly humiliated and dismissed as beneath his notice, was delivering a performance that made his own technically perfect but emotionally cold. Interpretations seemed mechanical by comparison. For the first time in his life, he was confronting the difference between playing all the right notes and actually making music. The final passages of the movement built to a climax that left the audience breathless. Her hands flew across the keyboard with breathtaking speed and accuracy, but every note served the greater musical purpose. The power she generated was not just physical, it was emotional and spiritual. The kind of artistic communication that transforms a room full of strangers into a unified community of listeners, sharing a profound experience. When the final chord rang out and faded into silence, the hall remained quiet for what felt like an eternity. Then, as if a dam had burst, the audience erupted in the kind of standing ovation usually reserved for world-famous artists. People cheered, whistled, and applauded with an enthusiasm that shook the building. Many had tears in their eyes, moved by the raw emotional power of what they had just witnessed. She stood at the piano bench, slightly dazed by the overwhelming response. The weeks of preparation, the years of struggle, the moment of public humiliation, all of it had led to this instant of perfect vindication. She had not only proven her critics wrong, she had reminded herself of who she truly was as a musician and as a person. The judges didn't even need to deliberate. One of them, a distinguished professor from a major conservatory, was heard saying to his colleague, "In 40 years of teaching, I've rarely heard anything like that from a student." The competition had been decided the moment she played her final chord, though 2 other finalists would be selected to maintain the formality of the process. As she walked off the stage, she passed the elite pianist in the wings. For the first time since she had known him, he looked uncertain, almost vulnerable. His carefully constructed world of musical hierarchy and inherited privilege had been shattered by someone he had considered beneath his notice. The look he gave her contained a mixture of shock, respect, and something that might have been fear, the fear of someone who had just realized that talent and passion could triumph over pedigree and arrogance. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of congratulations and amazed conversations, but she barely heard any of it. She had reclaimed not just her musical identity, but her sense of self-worth and belonging. The girl who had hidden in practice room 204 was gone forever, replaced by the artist she had always been meant to be.